Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Thanks, sponsors. Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication, ComC.com, Burbank Sports Cards, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Heritage Auctions, Hugs and Scott Auctions, Topps, Upper Deck, and Panini. Actually, this episode will be a little bit about Panini in the sense that I had Greg Landsdowne on episode 624 about 3.5 years ago. And he is doing a sequel. He's doing a 10th anniversary update of his book about Panini soccer stickers and the history of soccer cards and stickers. So I encourage you to get his book. But he sent me some questions, and rather than writing up the answers, I thought we'll just talk through this. But please get the book, because if you're interested, I have emphasized that I really believe knowledge is power, not just in this hobby, but in a lot of things. It's good to know. And when something comes out that's a good history, which Greg has already provided and is now updating, it's worth digging into it if you're going to get into soccer cards. Like I said, it's very difficult if you don't understand the sport, and it's very difficult if you don't understand the history of the hobby version of that sport. And Greg's book encourages you to do that. So anyway, these are the questions that he asked me that I'm going to read some of what he said to me in his letter. He said his next book is the 10th anniversary of Stuck on You, which covered the history of soccer stickers and cards in the UK, and I think Europe too. Up to that point, he said there were relatively few parallels between the hobby in North America and in the UK and Europe. They didn't know about graded cards, for example, rookie cards. There really weren't card shops or card shows. That's changing now. They didn't necessarily think that their soccer cards or stickers were worth very much, and they probably weren't worth that much if they were stuck in the albums, which was the intention and was part of the joy of the expression of the hobby in that. But collectors in America have a little more of a financial thing, and grading has exacerbated that. I'm not griping about it because it's really increased the hobby. It's brought a lot of enthusiasm. He said then COVID came along, and he said now, when the world has shrunk a little bit and became more digital through COVID, more of the UK and European collectors know about the whole hobby, the global hobby. And they realize that if their cards and stickers are in good shape, perhaps even authenticated and slabbed, they're going to be worth enough to generate some good money. So his next book is going to incorporate all that stuff, and he wanted to include some comments or perspective from me. So here's questions to me. He said there was little interest in valuing and grading cards and stickers in Europe and UK pre-COVID. He says, I'm assuming your engagement, meaning me, I think, with the sports collectibles industry over here was minimal before then. Do you find your interactions, recognition among collectors in the UK, Europe has grown over the last 5 years? Actually, we did have a presence in Europe. It was more in Scandinavia back, The hockey magazine at its peak had an edition in Sweden and I think one other country up there. But I know in Sweden, maybe in Norway, but they're hockey crazy over there. And it was translated. It was a licensed publication. It looked similar, except it was in kroner or whatever it was. I think our magazine may have been sold in some bookshops in the UK, but that wasn't a big deal. We were really big in Australia, especially with basketball. Yeah, I think we were always aware of Europe and hoping that it would come on. And certainly since COVID, I've gotten to be online friends with Torsten Bauer in Germany, who gives me some perspective of what's going over there. And that's been good. Then he says, I believe the sports card industries in the UK and Europe and North America remain largely disassociated, despite Europe now embracing a lot of what goes on over there. Do you see much desire among those in North America to change that? It's already happening, Greg. BGS is setting up in Germany. PSA is setting up in Germany. In fact, I was up picking up a grading order, and my good buddy that I meet with and get the cards back from was on his way next week to Germany to continue to put the systems together to be able to do business out of Germany as soon as possible. I think they're very excited about having a hub, and PSA is doing it too. Okay, it says your first sports card price guides came out in the 70s. What was it that made you think at a time when most sports cards were mass-produced and were being liberally handled and passed around without much thought about their condition, that a number of them could actually have some value? I don't think cards were liberally handled that much by the 80s. By the mid-70s, the late 70s, my first annual price guide came out in 79. Price surveys were launched in 76, but that was coming at a time where the collectors knew don't liberally handle your cards. And there became more supplies and all that kind of stuff to make sure that the cards were not messed up. So I think there was always some thought about condition, but it was about avoiding terrible condition. There were only a few people that were saying, I only want gem mint. They were ahead of the curve. Most of the activity in the mid-'70s, late '70s, '80s was about supply and demand, about the player, not as much the condition, although in the '70s there was a little bit of a premium for superstars and a little bit of a premium for gem mint. But now there's exaggerated premiums for the player and exaggerated premiums for the condition. So condition mattered, but not as much, and now it's critical, just like the player, the subject. And that increases the demand. In fact, the better the condition, the greater the demand, and the greater the price too. Let's see, he says your sports card publications began in '84, magazines that is, and are still going today, even in an era when print magazines are generally struggling. What numbers were they selling at their peak, and are you proud they still exist more than 40 years later? Proud isn't the word I would say. Yeah, certainly I am proud, but I want to still be proud at the point when print is no longer viable, not just because of the hobby, but just in general, people are moving more toward digital availability and products. And so maybe there's a digital magazine, but my pride that I have, and justifiably in the team that we had, great people, great products, but the products have to evolve. The people have evolved somewhat too. I want the brand to live on and flourish. And so that brand is not wrapped up in a magazine or in a print product. It's kind of like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They're originally completely print, but now there's a robust digital activity behind that brand. Sports Illustrated is more of a digital brand than a print brand. But yes, I'm proud that there's still a magazine, but they shouldn't have it if it's not profitable. Again, I'm no longer the owner, but I'm glad they're doing that, and I'm glad people support it, so I appreciate that. Okay, then he says, you pioneered an early grading system. How long did it take you to devise? First of all, that's not exactly true. I did not pioneer it. There were grading descriptors for grading for good, fair, poor, excellent, near mint, all those kind of things out there. And with Denny Eckes, my hobby publisher and great friend, we massaged it in my magazines, in the books that we did. We always prominently wanted people to know how to grade their cards. Now, in truth, people are not able to grade their own cards very well, hence the advent of grading. But Greg, I didn't pioneer it as much as I popularized it and I promoted it and possibly sharpened it. And that was over time. So it wasn't like I spent a weekend on it. No, I was already very immersed in the hobby and was trying to not create a grading system that was my opinion. I was trying to gain some sense of what the hobby expected in a mint card or in a very good card or a poor card, whatever it was. And that was one of the reasons we spent a lot of time developing the subgrades and kind of the algorithm to figure out when you have a certain configuration of subgrades, what does that lead to in terms of the technical overall grade? We just spent a lot of time on that. And I really wasn't in first chair on that either. They were coming to me with what they thought if they had a problem, they'd ask me a question. But Grant and Dan and Mark and several outstanding people really did all the legwork there. And that was a great contribution to the hobby. It says a lot of collectors in the UK and Europe are still largely in the dark about grading. How important is it for someone who wants to maximize the value of their collection? First of all, to protect their collection, to identify, to authenticate, to be able to get insurance, to be able to sell online, all those things I think come before worrying about maximizing the value of your collection. In fact, for my friends in the UK, grading, even if it's BGS, do not grade all your cards unless all your cards are gradable and are worthy of being graded. It does not maximize the value of your collection if you spend a lot of money on grading that you don't need to spend. So maximize the value of your collection after fees, and grading fees can be substantial. Next, at what point did your interest in collecting sports cards shift to thinking you could make it your career? Maybe Greg is thinking about this, and others of you. It was a side gig for a really long time. For decades, it was a side gig, and a lucrative side gig. And when I was 35, and I thought about it, but when I was 35, I kind of made the switch from being a hobbyist to in the hobby business of doing the magazines, even though I'd been a dealer. But that, again, that's like a side gig. But I really wound up quitting. I didn't actually quit my job, but I put my job into consulting. So I had time to do that. So my main thing was the magazines and the books shortly after my 35th birthday. And I certainly don't regret that. I just burned my candle at both ends for a few years and then off to the races, and it was great. I said, despite making it a career, have you always remained a collector at heart? I channel my inner Chris Sewell, that I'm a collector, investor, dealer in that order, in that sequence. I still am. I've always been a collector. The investor part of me is really just hold. I'm not going out and buying a bunch of stuff. I'm not a big flipper. I like to buy a collection every once in a while and massage it and sell off stuff. The dealing aspect that I have had for many years now is I'm trying to sell off 1% of my stuff. And it's not the best stuff, but the 1%, and I more than did 1% last month, more than did 1% the month before. So I'm trying to speed it up a little bit. I'm not nearing the end, but it's 100 months. So I'm probably 25 months into it, and I can see that I've got 25% less stuff than I had when I started. So that's good. So collector, investor, dealer in that sequence. The Men's Soccer Cup, World Cup, is going to be in the USA, actually in North America. Next year, is that a big opportunity for soccer cards to grow over here? Greg, I sure hope so. I sure hope so. We have been saying that for, what was that? The World Cup, was it 94? I think 94 was over here. That would be 30. Wow. So that's a long time. It'll be 32 years. Again, there's a tricky supply and demand. You can't just say, hey, we're going to double all our production quantities, anticipating the demand with the World Cup. And then if it's saturated, that's a bad thing. Some of those sets that were made 30 years ago are still very plentiful now. So they've got to walk that tightrope. And really, they need to be promoting. And this is an example where I'd love to see Panini and Fanatics and Topps, all of them really work toward, because they all have a stake. Upper Deck does have soccer in their Meta Universe products and other kinds of things. So I'd love to see all the card companies cooperate in the promotion aspect. Let the potential purchaser decide what products they want to get, but let's promote the hobby as a great expression of interest in soccer. Soccer is so big worldwide that it doesn't have to pass up American football or baseball or basketball, but it's got a lot of room to grow, especially outside the U.S., but I think it needs to grow in the U.S. That will help it grow other places. Greg, thanks for your hard work. As I've said many times, I love people that are not just thinking about doing a book, but actually do a book. And you're on, I think, book number 3. My hat's off to you. I've done a bunch of books myself, so it's a lot of work, but it's great when you finish it and you see it on the shelf or in somebody's hand. Thanks, Greg Landsdowne. Thanks, everybody, whether you're interested in soccer or not. Actually, it's good for the hobby. If the World Cup has some excitement, some card creativity that comes out, that's good for all of us. Thanks, Panini. Thanks, sponsors. Thanks, listeners. And I'll be back again in a couple days, another episode.